I'm toying. Every county in the state has what they call a VA commission. They're supposed to be working in various ways for veterans. The one for Monroe County here has 6 full-time officers who interview veterans about their needs and so forth, and help them with new things that they might be interested in. And she has about got me convinced that I should file a claim with VA for 6 months of the 4 years that I was in the Philippines in World War II, combat engineers. I was in charge with a platoon of men of an explosives depot. And Manila was the base supply line for all of our effort throughout Far East. And these 18-wheelers would unload these explosives, and they'd travel through Manila to Las Piñas, which is about 15 kilometers south. And we'd store these things and occasionally, very sparingly, issue them out for some construction projects. But the problem was that little Filipino toddlers with an aunt or an uncle or somebody would come with a pair of pliers and cut a hole in the barbed wire fence 8 feet high, and they'd come in and they'd steal these explosives devices for grandma, grandpa, or somebody, because they were very useful in fishing. They were illegal, but they'd stun the fish within about 15 feet where you set it off. And unfortunately, a number of these Filipino toddlers were seriously injured or hurt. One of them I was able to get to a nearby little regional hospital, and he recovered. And about a year later, in on foot came this pair of people from the barrios up in the hills, and they wanted to celebrate with, at that time, Lieutenant Baldwin. So we went up into the hills. We had 1 chicken. I had 2 siblings also in their family up on a stilted little kind of thatched cabin. But I have no proof, I may have begun hearing problems there, which began actually with me about 10 years ago. So she's convinced me that I ought to file a claim. It'd probably take at least a year for them to process it, and there may nothing come out of it. I don't know, but you know, I'm not desperate, but I have to budget fairly carefully. And if that claim were to be approved before I reach 125, that's $150 a month, minimum. Claims that are approved, I wish the Senate in Washington, every time they seriously consider going to war, might review the consequential costs on down the road for years of doing it. But that the very minimum is $150, and it varies to $3,500 a month for the balance of your life.
Wow.
Well, anyway, that's a little off the subject.
That's
but
a light
in regard to my hearing aids, which I've had for about 6 years. My birthday is June 26, 23. In the early 20s of our country, at least in the year 23, two things happened. The Teapot Dome scandal of President Harding, and I first saw the light of day. I was in combat engineers of the Army. Combat engineers are similar to the Seabees. And our outfit in the Philippines, we were usually concerned in three things: Bailey bridges and portable airfields and looking over our shoulder. Fortunately, I was never seriously hurt. Once they shipped me off to Baguio in the northern part of Luzon with dengue fever, which is kind of a mild malaria. Sometimes can evolve into messy situations, but lots of times it doesn't. Unfortunately, it didn't with me. I was in several forts in the South when I first went into service. Fort McClellan, Camp Breckenridge, a stint at a big hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. Well, I finished my sophomore year at Syracuse University in early June, and the next week I was on a train to Long Island. Camp Irving Berlin wrote a couple of his musicals there, I can't remember. So I spent about a year, and that wound up with going to engineer OCS in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. And when I finished that, and they razz me here every Memorial Day and Veterans Day we've just gone through, I still get in my 1944 officer's uniform. And most of my buddies, due to very practical reasons, have shelved their uniform. Actually, how this started, and I'll ramble here. On January 8th, 1941, I was on the third floor drafting room of the engineering college. I was majoring in chemical engineering. And I listened to the FDR's famous speech, the Day of Infamy, so forth, you know. And he really got to me. And he really did. So when he finished, I got down off the stool, I went down the elevator, and I walked 18 blocks to downtown Syracuse and enlisted. When I got home that night, I lived in Fayetteville, suburb of Syracuse. My parents were not very happy with that decision I had made, but they were supportive. And then they deferred me that year because I was an engineering student. Then they deferred me the second year, sophomore. When I finished the second year in early June, the next Monday I was on a troop train to Long Island, which is neither here nor there. Battle as well. My outfit, we came in after a lot of the rough stuff, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, so forth. And I have a lot of respect for the military aspect of General Douglas MacArthur. I don't think so much of his political views, but I think he did a good job in monitoring the evolution of Japan from a feudal country to a modern democracy. I have to give him credit for that. But in genius, Luzon is the biggest island of the Philippines. Goes from the northwest to the southeast, and there are something like 750 islands in the Republic of the Philippines. But the Japanese, in their occupation, they had fortified the southern part of Luzon and the southern boundaries of Manila. The central part of old Manila had 18-foot walls built by the Spanish when they controlled it. Well, MacArthur grew up there because his father was in charge of the small American contingent at the time of the Spanish-American War. I mean, he knew that area like a book. Well, anyway, he sent a small portion slowly working their way up through Luzon toward Manila. But most of us, with a lot of help from the U.S. Navy, went way up all the way around Luzon and came down rapidly from the north on the north side of Manila, which had not been fortified at all. Praise God. But those forced marches. Anyway, most of us got through, and that turned out to be very successful, because we now know excavations and other things. The Japanese had so fortified the southern part, which was heavily rock, that if the invasion of Japan had taken place, now historians say the Normandy invasion would have been thought to be a picnic. The first predictions from accurate reporters at that time was the minimum casualties that would take place would be at least 1 million. A lot of Americans still don't really know that, but praise God, I was scheduled twice to go to Japan, but the bomb ended that. I never had any great question as a clergy person, as well as a human being, about the legitimacy of the first bomb. But from the hindsight of 60 years, I still have questions about the necessity of the second bomb, 4 days later, which killed 90,000 more Japanese. But General Marshall, President Truman, a couple other key people in Washington, they felt the second one was necessary. Anyway, that's what happened. War is often not only very ugly, but very cruel, and you often get realistic perspectives on it later down the road. But if one of the blessings I think this country has, maybe the world has, is that invasion of Japan never took place. But I mean, bright things. I used to play a clarinet. We used to call it a gobstick. And with 2 or 3 others, we recruited a local Filipino musician just as the war was ending. And a few members who were still available from the Manila Symphony. We put on a concert in the ruins of the cathedral in old Manila. So in the midst of all that suffering that people had absorbed, this is the last couple of 3 months of the war. We did our best to offer Brahms, Beethoven, Dvorak, you name it. And people, a lot of civilians sitting around in the ruins of the cathedral. I like to think that that's one of the best small things that I was involved in the latter days of the war. So, anyway.
Do you still play the clarinet? Do you still play the clarinet?
No, I don't. Camaraderie of the troops, yes. My time mostly from the latter days of the war was in Manila, and then this Las Piñas 6 months assignment for this explosives depot. And then I went further, another 15, 20 kilometers to what was called Subbase R, or Batangas. And actually I took my discharge there and worked 1 year for the Army as the supposedly responsible financial officer for Batangas. Reason for enlisting. FDR's speech really got me right here. Rightly or wrongly, I thought it was a great short speech. I was in a home in Manila. Dr. Henry Sloan Coffin, the ex-president of Union Seminary in New York, and he had been sent by the Presbyterian Church to survey Presbyterian mission facilities all over the Far East. And then as a result of that, a restoration campaign was begun, which raised a lot of money and spent it out there to replace a number of these facilities. And I had the pleasure one Sunday afternoon in a home of a mutual friend of kind of being interviewed by Uncle Henry, as we called him at that time. I wound up, after I'd graduated from Syracuse, I wound up with a little bit unusual seminary. A year at Edinburgh University in Scotland. Nancy and I, when I finally graduated in June of '50, we went with a group of American students, and we spent 3 or 4 places around Europe in work camps. And wound up in Edinburgh, and that's where I did 1 year of seminary. And then I came back to a 2nd year at Union Seminary in New York, and the 3rd year at Yale Divinity School. So I have a kind of a mixed up or unusual seminary background.
Why did you decide to go to seminary?
Well, I think I probably had Nancy's father probably had some influence on it. And this time I did go, they had a kind of a trial weekend several times a year at Union Seminary for those who might be interested. I absorbed one of those. I probably began to have a little more serious thinking in the war from what I've seen and absorbed. I'm no peacenik, and I'm proud of the time I spent in World War II. Nothing terribly significant except trying to do what had to be done. But I guess I'm a little crazy. Looking back from my perspective of '93, I don't have much sympathy with any war that we'd been in since World War II, which was the last time we officially declared war. We've maneuvered ourselves through diplomacy and other ways into all the conflicts since, but never with any thorough discussion on the floor of the Senate and an official voting of declaration of war. But as I say, I'm not a peacenik, but it just seems to me, looking back through these Korea, especially Vietnam and Iraq, the money that we've spent and the lives that have been lost, and if you try to look at it realistically and say in a hard-nosed faced way, what were we up against? Was it worth it? What did we gain from it? I think the Chinese threat in Korea and Vietnam through the years, now I think most historians say it was nowhere near being close to full-scale combat as it was then through the media and other ways. But they're that. Foreign civilians responded to Allied troops. Well, I was in Manila for a while in the latter days of the war. In terms of politics, our outfit came in behind MacArthur and President Quezon, Manuel Quezon, the first president of the Philippines who was suffering terribly from TB and died within a couple of years. I do remember it seemed as though for a period of time there, a good way for a defeated politician in an election in America, a nice plum was to be appointed ambassador to the Philippines. I remember most of the time that I was there was a former governor of Indiana, pretty handsome guy, white-haired, so forth, so on. He'd been defeated, and one of the last things that FDR did before he became ill and died was to appoint him ambassador to the Philippines. In a Presbyterian church, by the way, our headquarters of of a lumber and supply depot in Manila was about 2 blocks from the American Embassy. So we had some contact with Britain, Russian, French, and also with other American units. My church in Flushing, Queens, I had a Sunday school superintendent who was an engineer for Western Electric, used to be the supply for the Bell telephone system, Ray Eckeblad. And he had been, it turned out, we never had contact, but we had been for a time within a couple miles of each other. He was assigned to a Negro battalion where all the officers were white, by the way. And he was an intelligent guy. And he came back and he did a lot of work in personnel in Western Electric to get them, to offer better opportunities and getting more government contracts, including 5 or 10% minority hiring. It's funny, we were a couple hours, a couple miles from each other, but we never had contact. But he was a great guy, and I think he made a great contribution to race relations. Meals? Well, I had my share out of canteens, but basically, except for those few times, we had pretty decent meals. I'm a lifetime member of VFW, for better or for worse. I think there's been a lot of change. For instance, I think for about the first 5 years after Vietnam, I think most veterans, I have to be careful about this, were not fully accepted by American citizens because a good number of American citizens had questions about the legitimacy of the Vietnam War. But that's changed now. I think Vietnam veterans now are fully accepted as veterans in American society, but for about 5 years or more, they weren't. And I think they are from Iraq. The irony sometimes of wartime, our combat medicine is a lot better than it was when I was in the war 60 years ago. And that's a blessing, that's a boon we should be proud of. But the flip side of that is, you take these injured from Iraq and we fly them to a big hospital in Germany, and then we fly them home. And they get all kinds of care, some of them. The waiting list for other than emergency about 2 years ago was about 2 years for better care. Now it's down to about, I think it's down to about 10 weeks. Well, that's too bad, but you got to give the government and the VA, both parties, some credit for that. To decrease that from 2 years to 10 weeks is quite an achievement. But I've got a captain's uniform that I had on Veterans Day here, and I usually have on Memorial Day. But
Have you
I
ever?
don't know, I've wandered all over the map here. I have a married son in Elmira who's doing quite well in real estate, and I have grown twin daughters. One is here in Fairport. She has her master's. She has a half-time position in a big hospital. It's not strong, but it's another one. But she's slowly building up a counseling practice. And her twin sister has her doctorate, lives in Avon, and she's in charge of all research at SUNY Geneseo. And they've got two big projects now. Both are multimillionaire. One has as an Institute of Entrepreneurship. The idea being that a lot of graduates from college these days still haven't been oriented very much to the nuts and bolts of the workaday world out there. And this is to try to interest a lot of them of the importance of that if they're going back into the war and not going on to another degree. And the other one is South Litchfield area. It's in conjunction with the State Department of Conservation, some kind of an environmental thing there so that science majors and climate change activists and others can get a thorough training other than just academic. And she's got her fingers pretty deeply in both of those, for better or worse. Actually, her other sister, the sister here in Fairport, who was an undergraduate at SUNY Geneseo, the college is about doubled. She was there. It was about 2,500 when she was there. It's about 5,000 now. About the same as Oneonta, for better or for worse. So we are closer to them than we were. We get together a number of times throughout the year. A birthday or an anniversary or a holiday. We got it. I think that last I knew, a couple days ago, Amy said there were 26 due for Thanksgiving dinner here in Fairport over Pebble Hill Drive. We've both been pretty lucky with health, generally. I mean, I got a new left hip 5 years ago. I've got hearing aids I've had for, I think, 6 years. I've had both cataracts done. But we've been married 67 years and had a nice family reunion a month or so ago, a family camp up on the Vermont side of Lake Champlain. A camp that Nancy's brother and wife largely have and handle now. And we're very fortunate, I think, here. The rent is a little stiff, but that includes lots of services. The lawn, minor landscaping in the summer, ice and snow in the winter, minor repairs, so forth and so on. And this is a nice 2-bedroom, 1-story facility. And there is a nice Y Head Start right at the head, just ahead here, a block away. So we do have some contact with toddlers and things. It's not completely gray beards, so to speak. And we're reasonably comfortable. We happen to be quite involved in a local Methodist church, and I'm in the VFW, and I'm still quite, for about 20 years, I've been quite active in Rotary, which is, I think the Rotary exchange student program is the largest private, non-governmental exchange program in the world. I think if that kind of thing were multiplied 50 times, maybe we'd go to war a little less often. I don't know. But as I say, I'm not a peacenik. There are times when I think the military is useful, but I see in the New York Times this morning a full-page ad in by a group of supporters of Israel with a big picture of John Kerry as Secretary of State, criticizing him for being morally blind and not coming to the defense of Israel as much as he should. Well, I think he's tried in a difficult situation. So have a lot of other presidents going way back to settle between Palestinians and the Israelis. It's a tough and complicated problem. But this big picture, Terry, if you weren't so morally blind, I mean, here's a man who's been 3 terms a U.S. Senator, a candidate for the presidency of the United States, and been Secretary of State now for most of a term, and I'm sure he's not a candidate for sainthood, but I think to call him with his background morally blind seems to me kind of gilding the lily a bit. But if you're going to try to make a contribution diplomatically in the Middle East, it's difficult between these two groups, I think. Well, I've spotted away at the mouth for quite a bit. Maybe you have a question or two.
Have you ever done an honor flight?
Pardon?
Honor flight?
Have you ever done an honor flight down to Washington, D.C.?
Yes, I did. When we were in Oneonta, we were on an honor flight to Washington, and I enjoyed that very, very much. And right over there is a gentleman who's just back about a month ago. It's an extension of the honor flight. They're beginning to do it to Europe, particularly those who are in Normandy and Germany. He was a medical technician, and he's just come back from a week in
Peter Dupre?
Germany and northwest France.
Was it Peter Dupre?
Was his name Peter Dupre?
Peter Dupre.
Yes.
I spoke with him last week.
Oh, you've already touched base with him then. Yeah. Well, that's an interesting extension from what was started with honor flights to the memorial in Washington. Yeah, I enjoyed that very much. Actually, in my immediate family, I'm the only one who was in military service, but in our extended family, both sides were loaded with them. I have three who were in World War One, and Nancy's mother was kind of a Red Cross nurse in World War One. And the most significant thing about that, I guess, that we occasionally refer to, is she dated Captain Eddie Rickenbacker twice in Paris.
Wow.
So if things had turned out a little bit differently, who knows? But on her side, there were 5 in World War II, ranging from colonel on down to private. And we inch forward, I think, slowly, but I'm still enough of an optimist. I think this is a great country. I think we have a lot to be proud of in our leadership in international affairs and some things. But diplomatically, I think until they put me in a coffin, I would have questions about Vietnam and Iraq. I noticed even Jeb Bush, the president's brother, he made a very brief statement about a month ago that he never would have gone into Iraq. Now, he paid a political price for that, but I think as we go on, there will continue to be more questions, particularly about those 2 recent, comparatively recent conflicts. As to the, I don't want to gild the lily here, as to the worthwhileness and the appropriateness of both of those conflicts, which cost us very heavily in human lives, both American and civilian, and in billions of dollars of equipment. But here we are, and you know, even every once in a while the sun still shines.
Well, you were a combat engineer. What did you do as part of that?
It was mostly building Bailey bridges to get across where bridges had been bombed out, and portable airfields with strips about this wide and 8 feet long. You hook them together, and you'd have a part of your people with guns on your boundaries that you wouldn't be surprised. And then running this explosive depot for 6 months, and then being a part of running building a lumber and supplies depot. I'll tell you one little thing. A depot in Manila. This was not too far from the American embassy. We had a big Navy cube in the corner up on stilts was our gas tank. Filled a lot of vehicles, so forth and so on. And I didn't know about it at the exact time. I was a rather young lieutenant in charge of the depot on this particular day. And here come in 2 cars with a couple of admirals. There was a big U.S. Navy base about 6 blocks away, and a couple of 4-star generals. Geez, and I'm a relatively young lieutenant at that time. They get me off in the corner. "Lieutenant, are you aware that you have put General MacArthur out of contact with the world?" Jeez, I didn't know what was coming off. Well, anyway, there had been a receiving station at Las Piñas, and the cables came in to City Hall, and MacArthur had a suite in City Hall in Manila. And apparently a cigarette or something had started a fire that got to that cube, and that cube, there was no explosion, but we had quite a fire there for about an hour. And then I had a signal depot about 3 blocks away, and I could send somebody over there, and they sent somebody, and within an hour we had everything fixed okay. But that was it. I was the temporary officer in charge with 2 admirals, 2 4-star generals, that I had put General MacArthur out of contact with the world for a little over an hour and a half. They did impress it on my mind quite fully, I'll tell you. But anyway, we all survived that. It seems to me that, I hope I'm not elaborating, but it seems to me that what we were fighting for and what we were fighting against was a little more clear-cut in World War II than any conflict since. And since then, I don't want to elevate World War II beyond what it ought to be, but it seems to me our values and strategies in all of these others, Korea, Vietnam, various ones in the Middle East, seems to me that the values, strategies have been a little more muddied, not quite as clear-cut, and in none of them have we felt it appropriate, even though our Constitution says we shall not go to war unless the Senate has a vigorous debate, unless they vote that we go to war. But I don't blame George Bush the younger too much for that, because he turned it over to the Senate. But the Senate neglected that portion of the Constitution. We voted less than half an hour in debate. The Senate voted, and 3/4 of them voted to go to war in Iraq, and 1/4 voted not to. Actually, the Senate, they skirted around their responsibility. They gave the president authority to take us to war if he felt it appropriate. Well, in a way, they flipped over on their basic responsibility. That's what the Constitution says, whether you like it or not. You debate this vigorously and fully, and if you vote, the president is obliged to follow that vote. You go to war, or if you vote not to go to war, then he can't take you to war. But that's 60 years ago. I just hope that in the future, maybe there'll be further legislation that there really ought to be required some period of vigorous debate, pro and con. VFW, 6 months ago, I tried to get a little debate going. I suggested to my brothers at a monthly meeting, why don't we have a debate here conducted only by veterans? One who thinks that we should pursue vigorously peaceful means every time we have with a conflict. Another one who felt we should go whole hog militarily and try to solve it in a shorter period of time. And one who feels that we should organize a blend of military and diplomacy and economic means that we gradually pull out of a conflict. And then open it up for questions. Well, I consider it half a victory. They didn't throw me out. They considered it. We still haven't done it, but at least they considered it. And I thought that would have been interesting.
If you have any other, anything else you'd like to share, please do now, otherwise.
Well, I think I've saturated you with hopping all over the lot, and thank you for coming. I hope what you derive all of this you feel will be helpful, beneficial to some people anyway. And I'm not at the point of jumping off a Brooklyn Bridge because of the hopelessness of everything. I still think there are interesting ingredients of hope here and there. And somehow in the providence of God that they will flower. I guess I'll put it that way. But I guess I am something of a critic. Jesus, those poor people and the beauty and the loveliness of Paris today. Now they've increased the estimates of death to about 100, 6 different spots. That's the thing that concerns me. I think it's the first time that terrorists have had a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah.
But maybe some good things would come out of that. Like in World War II, terrible as that was, some good things came out for medicine. The development of penicillin, for instance, was just one thing. The development of synthetic rubber for all kinds of tires, so forth. But again, the flip side of that is a small number of these injured come back and will need care for the rest of their lives. And I'm not sure when we've decided to go to war that we were aware of the consequences way down the pike. But some good things came out of World War II. You're welcome. Just one other little thing I'll show you for what it's worth.
Oh.
I still get into this for better or for worse.
Wow.
Oh my goodness.
Hold it up and she'll take a picture.
Oh. That's amazing.
I put that on in June of '44 when I finished engineer OCS at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. And the next week, in one of Kaiser's Liberty ships to the Far East.